In a world where anything is possible, in a world where the normal and the paranormal reside, Almost Unbelievable brings to you the stories you want to hear, but fear to hear. Join us in the pit. You have joined the Almost Unbelievable podcast with Catz and Ranty. I'm Ranty. Are you there, Catz?
Yes, I am here, Ranty.
Wonderful. Well, we have a guest today, and I believe the guest got in touch with you there. Catz, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, today's guest has got a fantastic story about a potentially haunted house. Have you ever been to a haunted house, Ranty? Have you ever been on a ghost hunt or anything like that?
Well, no. I mean, the closest I've got to some kind of ghost hunt was when I went to Pendle Hill, and it was on Halloween, and I tried to scare my sister at the top of the hill, but she'd never seen the Blair Witch film, and I was hiding behind a wall trying to scare her by banging some rocks, but unfortunately she'd never seen it, so she didn't even get the noises. I thought it would have terrified her, but there you go. So in answer to your question, I haven't actually been to a haunted house, but I have been to a supposedly haunted area. That's the best I can say.
Well, Pendle Hill's amazing. I don't live too far from there, and at Halloween we always go up and we have a look on the hills, and it is really eerie, isn't it? When you're up there and the fog is setting down, it gets dark, it's very creepy.
And cold and windy. I didn't think it would be quite that cold and windy. I actually got a speeding ticket too because there's a hill down there, and I didn't realise it was just a 30 zone, and it was like a 1 in 10 hill, and I was doing 40, so life.
Horrendous. So I suppose there's worse things that can happen there. Worse things have happened to people up in Pendle in the past, I suppose. I have been to a haunted house when I was back teaching science. I took a load of kids to a haunted house so we could do an experiment and get used to using the data logging equipment and setting up proper controlled experiments to see if we could catch a ghost. Do you think we saw anything?
Well, I have seen some of those on the telly, and they apparently pick things up, or they pick up some kind of readings, so I'm going to say yes, maybe you did.
Well, we didn't pick up anything on the equipment, but I didn't go alone. I wasn't the only teacher there. There were two other teachers there who did claim that they'd seen and even felt something when they were in some rooms on their own. And the kids as well kept claiming they were seeing things out the corner of their eye, but I specifically didn't experience anything. However, the guest on today's show has experienced something, and he wasn't the only one. Should we get him on to hear about his experience?
Indeed, sounds good to me. Should we just get straight into it?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So, we are joined today by Mr. T, and Mr. T has a story about some banging noises and a thing with the front door. I'm sure we're going to enjoy this story, but for now we are joined by Mr. T. Mr. T, do you want to tell us exactly what happened?
Thank you, Randy. It was about 4 years ago. I was working in Aberdeen on a wind farm. I was staying in a little village just outside of Aberdeen called Ellen. I was renting a room with another fella who was also renting a room in a shared house. The guy who owned the house, just for a bit of backstory, worked in London most of the time, so he was only there 3 weeks out of the month. So it was generally just the two of us in the house. The strange happenings occurred the first night the other guy moved in. We were both sat in the front room, just having a chat as you do when you meet someone. And we were making fun of the guy who owned the house because his name was Chris with a K, and we were saying, "Oh, maybe he's a woman," and whatnot. We were being quite loud and boisterous as you are, and we heard a noise come from upstairs, directly upstairs, which would have been his bedroom, walking from what would have been his bed over to the window and then back again. At which point we thought, "Uh-oh, this guy's heard us." So we quietened down. About 20 minutes later, Chris walked through the front door, which was quite shocking, surprising and scary to the pair of us, who told him, and he said, no, there's definitely no one upstairs. Went upstairs and checked. Everything was as it should be. So that was the first initial incident of something strange occurring in that house. A couple of weeks later, again, Chris wasn't there. He was back down in London. We're both in bed, separate rooms, obviously, and we heard the front door open and slam shut. But we didn't hear the the patio door open before and shut before or after the door shut. So we both went downstairs to double check we'd locked the front door. Every light was off. Everything was as it should be. We were both getting a bit uneasy at this point because this wasn't the first time we'd heard a noise in the house. several other incidents occurred where we heard people walking up and down the stairs, walking along the landing, different doors opening and shutting, a window opening and shutting. But every time we went to investigate, everything was as it should be.
You were staying in this house while you were working. It wasn't your actual house, was it? It was a temporary house.
Yeah. It was just that I just found a house on Gumtree, and it was within the distance of where I was working and within the price range of what I wanted to pay.
And it was rented.
Yeah.
So when you went through the letting agency to get the house, did anybody mention anything about strange history with the house? Or
I went direct to the actual renter because he was doing it quite cheap because the house was up for sale. So it was like, you will have a month's notice to move out if I sell my house. So it was extremely cheap for what I was getting. Basically, it was like 200 quid cheaper than anywhere else in the area.
So he seemed pretty keen to get out and get someone in.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
He did tell us a couple of stories afterwards. Apparently, the former owner's father had died in the downstairs bedroom, which was like next to the front door, had its own private bathroom and stuff. And he said he'd heard noises coming from that room. And his daughter, when she lived there, refused to stay in the room.
Okay, so when you say you went and checked out these bangs and the windows being open, etc., did you go immediately?
It was more of a wait a few seconds to see if we hear someone coming in, because like I say, there was more than just the two of us living in the house. There was this guy commuting to London for 3 weeks a month and coming back, so he was it wasn't unusual for him to turn up late at night and let himself in, obviously because it's his house. But if we didn't hear anything for a few minutes, it's like, right, why haven't we heard a noise? Why haven't we heard the lights come on? Or why haven't we heard any more doors open? Maybe we need to go and check, because I mean, we're both youngish lads, so it's not unusual for us to forget to lock the door or forget to close windows or whatever.
I'm trying to put myself into Catz's head here and try and find a logical reason for this. If you was going to give a number, how many instances do you think happened in the time that you were there?
I was there for about 3 months, and it was, I couldn't even tell you how many. It was multiple a week. It was multiple a week. We'd hear people walking up the stairs or crossing the landing, and it reached the point where we started to not notice it because it happened that often.
Was it a terraced house?
Semi-detached.
Semi-detached. And where was the living room in relation to next doors? Because I'm assuming that you would have heard most of the noises from the living room.
Yeah, theirs was directly next door to our living room, so you could hear their telly and them speaking next door, but when we heard someone walking around upstairs, it was directly above us. Say you sat in your room and somebody gets out of bed above you, you hear them walk across and you can track them walking from the bed to the door, sort of thing. It was that specific when we heard them walking around.
See, I was going to ask that. I was going to ask, were the footsteps just noises like bangs, or did they have the rhythm and the movement that footsteps would have? You can hear the source of the sound changing.
We could track it from where his bed was to the window and then to the bedroom door. It was like you could plot it almost based on where you heard the footsteps.
I know this is a silly question because I'm sure you've thought of this, but did you share an attic with the house you were semi-detached with?
No, we didn't share an attic. We did ask him that. We said, have you got a shared attic? Because we had heard rustling noises upstairs, but I used to live in a house from the 1800s, so you always heard pigeons and what have you rustling around in the loft, so I never really noticed stuff like that. But we did hear slight noises. But he told us there is no part of the house that's attached to theirs apart from via the wall.
I do have another theory. So you did mention at the start of this that within the very first day that you actually turned up, you're taking the piss out of the guy that owned the house, and you're being very boisterous and laughing.
Just to clarify, I'd been there for a week at that time on my own.
But what I mean is, the first time you get together with somebody, you're taking the piss out of the guy that owns the house. Now, is it possible, because the guy did turn up, you said about 20 minutes later he did return home, is it possible that he was actually in the house and he heard this going on and he thought, I'm going to teach these little bastards?
That would have been a good prank, but no, the only entrances, the entrance and exit, there was a sliding patio door for the back garden that was attached to the living room, and then to get in through the front door, you had to come through the living room to get to upstairs.
So this is interesting, and I know it was a long time ago, and you've obviously moved out of the house since then and moved on. But have you ever been back to that place, and have you ever thought about knocking on the door, seeing who's there now, and asking them if they've ever experienced anything like that?
If I ever went to Aberdeen, I would, but it's a few hundred miles away from where I am right now, so it's not exactly convenient. But it is something I wouldn't mind doing. Even if I could get in touch with the old landlord, unfortunately, I think he's changed his number because I did try and message him when you replied to me with the email the other day.
Did you actually see anything? Or did you just hear things?
We never actually saw anything. The other guy claims he saw like a dark shadow in the corner of the room, of his bedroom, but I never stayed in that room, so I couldn't clarify that.
And was that just the once or several
He
times?
said he saw it a couple of times. He said he felt uneasy a few times, and then a couple of times he seen like a dark shadow in the corner, but it was like where you'd expect a shadow, but he was saying it seemed bigger, and then other times it seemed like a normal shadow, and then other days when he felt really uneasy, it seemed bigger, but I don't know whether that was just like a psychological thing, possibly.
Yeah, the state of mind that you were already in.
Yeah.
Was the house an old house or was it a new one?
I think it was built in the 80s. It was either built in the 70s or the 80s, the house we was in.
So that's interesting because you'd expect with an older house, perhaps you'd have like creaky floorboards and, a bit of movement and things like that was making some of these noises, perhaps. Was it double glazed? Was it single glazed?
All double glazed and everything. It was quite modern considering the age of the house. Like, you know what I mean? It had modern fixtures and fittings.
So you don't think there's any way that there could be any drafts that have come into the house that have affected anything? The creaking of doors, if there's a draft coming through that's opening and closing doors, maybe banging, things like that.
Not to the extent that we were getting it. Cause like I say, one point it sounded like the front door, which was them PVC double glazed newish front door things. We heard that open and slam shut, and we thought, oh, he's come home, but then we didn't hear any other noise, and it's like, oh, we better go and check that because it sounds like someone's come in the house. And then there was nothing, no disturbance to anything. The door was locked.
Were there any other sort of phenomena that you tend to associate with, ghosts and hauntings? Did things get moved? Would the temperature suddenly drop? That kind of thing?
Unfortunately, it was in Scotland and it was like January, February sort of time, so it was cold as hell anyway.
Baltic. Well, would you say that you are somewhat of a skeptic, or would you say that you've always been awake to this kind of thing, or was this totally new to you? Were you scared in the past about other things, or was this the only instance of only this happening at this time?
I am skeptical about this sort of thing, but I have had weird experiences that people say, oh, there's no way you can believe in ghosts based on all the stuff you say. It's like, but there's no other explanation I can logically think of to explain it. But like I say, I used to live in a house it was built in the 1800s, like an old servant's house for an old manor house. And I saw some strange things in there, but nobody ever believed me when I told them.
What kind of stuff?
Well, there was one time I had a metal, the standard metal thermoses you have. I had one of them on the fireplace, and it made this weird rattling noise. And I didn't think anything of it because where the fireplace was, there was the boiler next to it in my room. So I just thought I was just going to move that because the boiler was making it rattle. And I was about probably 2 or 3 centimeters away from touching it, and then it just stopped rattling. And I thought, yeah, I'm not going to keep this thermos in my room anymore. This doesn't seem right. And then there was one time, I think I was about 15, 16, and I was living at my mum's, and I went in the kitchen to get something to eat, and I seen someone stood in the garden and proper crap my pants, thinking, oh crap, there's someone in the garden. And then when I looked again, there was no one there. But what confused me about that is we had one of those motion sensor lights for the garden that went off if like a cat walked through or the tree moved a little bit. And that didn't come on. And it was one of them. I can't really explain it, but it was late at night. So I just kind of put it down to tiredness or my brain playing tricks on me.
Do you keep in touch with the guy that stayed in the house with you?
I did do until recently. I've not been able to get in touch with him recently because, like I say, I tried to get in touch with both him and the landlord as well.
I mean, obviously, you must have spoken about this since to him.
Yeah. He lives in Brighton, and I went down to see him. I think it was last year, and we was telling his current housemates about it, and they was just laughing at the pair of us. In fact, he brought it up because I'd come down there saying, this is the guy who was with me when this happened.
So it's obviously something that's stuck in his mind, and he's carried on telling that story to other people. It's something that's been a significant memory for him then.
Yeah, it's one of the strangest, most paranormal things I've ever experienced, and I don't really believe in paranormal or afterlife or ghosts or anything, so it doesn't really fit in with what I personally believe.
And that's why this is interesting, because we have spoken before, and I know you are quite skeptical about a lot of things. You don't kind of easily jump on a bandwagon of anything that's paranormal or supernatural or anything like that. So to hear you telling this story and be scratching around for some kind of solution, I'm sure you've sat at home and you've gone through all the questions. Has it been, something loose in the attic? Was the attic probably properly boarded? Was it wind? Was it mice? Was it? I'm sure you've gone through all of those things, and still not to have an answer is quite intriguing to me.
Yeah, it's quite stressful to myself to not have an answer for something like this after this amount of time as well. It's like, how can I not explain this occurrence? There should be a very simple explanation, and I don't want to say ghosts because it sounds dead childish to say, "Oh yeah, I believe in ghosts because I heard a weird noise."
What about bats or anything like that, or rats even?
So I wouldn't think bats due to the time of the year, but I even lived in like a pub up until last year, and that was always having trouble with rats and stuff. And it was like a constant like scratching sort of thing. You know what I mean? It was like a very distinct noise when you hear animals mooching around in the loft or in the walls or whatever.
Bangs and knocks and sounds in old houses especially can be quite easily explained, but from what you're saying, you had the ability, like you said, to track that movement like you would a person who's walking across, and that makes things much more difficult to explain, that side of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, if it was just footsteps, I would have quite happily just put it down and said, "Oh, we can hear the footsteps from the bedroom next door." But it was the way it, like you say, you could track it across the room and where it went to in the room.
Could it have been piping? Like as the central heating warms up the house, was it the movement of the water through the pipes that was perhaps banging against something, putting some kind of pressure on a floorboard or a joist or something like that was making you think that that movement or that effect was actually somebody walking on the floorboards, or was it absolutely of somebody walking on a floorboard?
If I had to say, I would have definitely said it was walking round because it seemed to match, like the distance you'd expect between like an adult taking steps and how heavy the steps would be and how long it took to get from one part of the room to the next all seemed to match like an average sized adult walking around.
Well, what interests me more than anything is the fact that after a period of time, you told us that you essentially just let these things happen and didn't particularly worry about it. Now,
But
if you were making these things up, you would hear every noise and you would immediately start to have a panic attack and what's that? What's that? But the fact that you just got on with these noises as they were going on tells me that it wasn't something psychological.
and I was working quite long days, so by the time I got home, I was tired and wanted to go to bed. I didn't really care by that point.
Was there a particular time of day that this seemed to happen more frequently?
See, I was only in from 7 at night to about 8 at night till 6 in the morning. They were the only times I was ever in the house because I was working 7 days a week.
And what about your partner? Was he the same?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. He got one day off a week, but he went out like to the pub and that in the day with a. He was actually from Scotland, despite living in Brighton, so he had a few friends around there he used to go out drinking with when I was in work and he had nothing to do.
I've only got one last question, and that's: was the house on a hill? Was it exposed in any way to any kind of wind?
It was on a hill somewhat, but it was quite a. It's hard to explain. There was like houses around it, so there was no like direct wind as such. There was a bit of wind. The roof would have got a bit of wind, but other than that, there wasn't really anywhere to hit.
And it couldn't have been, sometimes on these on your roofs when you go into the actual attic, the catch or the loft hatch can sometimes be pulled around and moved as it's windy outside. So it creates like a suction, a vacuum sort of thing inside the loft space, and it can rattle that type of door. Was it that, or was the door secured down the hatch?
I couldn't say either way, but based on the sounds, I wouldn't have thought it would have been that hatch. Based on like the intenseness of the sounds, and like say when we heard the sounds from upstairs, when we was upstairs, we heard the sounds downstairs.
I think we've asked you all the questions you've probably already thought about yourself. So it's like,
I was hoping you guys would be able to answer them for me.
Well, maybe we will. You never know, because this is the time of the show now where me and Ranty will say goodbye, but then we'll get our thinking heads together and see what we can make of that fantastic story you've just given us. Actually, I was really interested in that, and especially because, like I said, I've spoken to you before, and I know that you would have sat down and thought about all the possible reasons for this before.
Every time I get drunk with my mates, this comes up, and everyone tries to come up with reasons, and none of us can.
See, there you go, Catz. There you go, Catz. Yeah, I'm telling you.
Well, we shall have a think. We'll say goodbye to you now, and then, like I say, me and Ranty will get our heads together, and we'll see what we make of it. But listen, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, cheers for having me, guys.
Well, what a wonderful story. And Catz, what have you got to say about what you've just heard? Can science answer that?
Well, out of all the stories we've heard so far, and we have heard a lot, this one really has got me stumped for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I've spoken to our guest before a couple of times, and I know he is a very skeptical individual. He's not the type of person who's just going to assume supernatural causes. And I know that he's thorough, and he will have looked around the house, and being in the house, he'll have looked at every single possible source for those noises, and he's obviously ruled them out in his head. So it's difficult for me that's never even been to the house to try and suggest something different. So do I believe that he's had those experiences? Yes, I do, because like I say, I've spoken to him and I know what he's like. Do I believe that he genuinely thinks he can't find an explanation for it? Yeah, I genuinely think that. Now, do I believe that the source was supernatural? Well, to me, there's possibly not enough evidence for that. I'd say that bangs and noises, etc., can be caused by a variety of different things. The interesting thing was that the noises, he said, could be tracked. He could hear them moving from one place to another, which maybe suggests to me, is it some sort of, animal? Is it something under the floorboards? I don't know, is my answer. I just don't think there's enough evidence to suggest it's supernatural, but I just cannot come up with an alternative explanation, especially knowing that he will have done that, or at least tried to do that himself. So, yeah, this one's got me stumped. What about you?
Well, I think as a whole, I think I'm just going to take everything as a whole here and just say, well, we've heard his recollection of what he actually went through, but then we've also got other people that were in the house at the same time too that also experienced these things and still talk about these things, and when they meet up they find that this is one of the topics of conversation that they end up naturally ending up discussing. So it seems to me that whatever went on, it definitely made an impression on all the people that were involved. So from that point of view, and obviously, as you say, you've spoken to this guy before, he's a skeptic, and yet he still wanted to come on the show and talk about this experience. Now, I can't offer him any kind of other explanation than it was a ghost. What can I say? I just feel that it sounds to me like a typical haunted house with a ghost or an entity just messing around, having a bit of fun. I don't think it was anything bad. I don't think it was a nasty entity. I just thought it was a playful entity. Could have been a young child, who knows? But for me, it's definitely paranormal, and I am going to say it's a ghost.
Fantastic. Well, if you have an opinion of your own, you want to let us know, you'd look in the description to this podcast. You'll be able to find all the places where you can find us on social media and get in touch. If you've got a story of your own, please get in touch and we would love to have you on. But for today, I'm going to say thank you for listening. Do you want the last word, Ranty?
Yeah, and I'm just going to echo that. Anybody with a story, anybody that's got anything that they want to get off the chest, if they want to come on the show and tell us about it, it could be UFOs, it could be, I don't know, werewolves, it could be ghosts, monsters, you name it, whatever it could be. If you've got a story and you want to get in touch, we're all ears. And as Kat says, I do have big ears.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.